They say that there is a sucker born every minute. Are you guys familiar with the term confidence game? No? That's kind of the longer version of it. It's more commonly called a con. A con. A con. You have the one who leads the con. He's the con man. That's what we call him. It stands for confidence man. If you ever wondered what con stood for, it actually is short for confidence. And that's what he's trying to get. He's trying to gain your confidence. And that's the reason why they call him that. So he's the one who runs the scam, is the con man or the confidence man. He does have people who work for him within the construct of the con, and they are called shills. But then you have the poor sucker that they're trying to swindle, and they refer to him as the mark or the rube. Sometimes even they call him the gull, which is short for the word gullible. So in the context, I have to tell you the story, okay? It's a wonderful story. Yeah. I knew that I couldn't skip over this story whenever I was putting this together, because that's what Solomon's really going to be talking about. He's going to be talking about, the biggest con of all time, really. And we were wandering, me and Mindy, we were wandering around the main street of Barcelona called La Rambla. And we happened upon this kind of small gathering there in the middle of Main Street. And there was a guy who was playing three-card Monte. Anybody ever played three-card Monte? I hope you haven't. It's otherwise known as Find the Lady, right? It's very similar to the shell game, popular shell game, except they use cards instead of shells. Now, three-card Monte, the reason why I'm glad you haven't played it is because three-card Monte is a confidence game. It's a con. The guy who's running the game, he has shills that are working for him in the crowd, right? And so they get people to place bets on the assumption that they can pick the money card from the three cards that are face down, on the towel or table or whatever they have laying down. And so Mindy approaches the table, and I'm standing back there. I'm watching this guy, he's doing the cards and all this, and she's just watching. And there's people throwing down bets and stuff like that. And the guy, the one guy's picking the card, he's like, I think it's there. And he pulls it up, and of course it's not the card. And Mindy was like, it was right there. She's like, I saw it. She's looking at me like, I saw the card. It was right there. And they do it again. And she's like, I know right where the card's at, And the guy tells her, he says, no. He says, you have to bet if you want to guess. And so she looks at me, and I'm like, I'm just backing away. I'm like, look, you, and I knew what was going on. I just wanted to see how it was going to play out. I just wanted to let her run with it. And she was like, I know right where the card is. I'm like, hey, you do you, man. Whatever you want to do, it's fine. And so she's looking at it, and she's like, oh, I don't know, and so I'm just watching. I'm just ear to ear smiles. I just think this is wonderful, what is happening. Of course, the guy talks her into throwing some of her money down because she knows right where the card is. So she throws her money down, and of course, he lifts up the card. It's not the card. It's gone. And she just, I don't know what it was, like 20 pesetas or something like that. Basically our dinner for that night. And she just threw that down, and the guy walks off with our money, and the look on her face, she looks at me like, what just happened? And I'm dying laughing. And so then I begin to tell her, okay, let me tell you what just happened. Okay, those people that were in the crowd that were betting, that were guessing before you came up, they work for him. And it's a con. They're trying to get you to bet, and he can move the cards anywhere that he wants them, right? And so it's a con. And so she just is distraught. Anyway, after a little while, telling her, it was going to be all right. We were fine. But it was a wonderful sight to see, because Mindy's the one who handles the money in our house. And she is very, how should I put this? Thrifty. She's very thrifty. So to lose 20 pesetas, which isn't a whole lot of money really, but it was wonderful just to watch it, because I'm usually the one who's throwing money down the toilet. So it was great. And so as the father in Proverbs is trying to train his son here in the mastery of wisdom, one of his practical goals here is to prevent his son from becoming a mark. That's what he wants to do. He wants to prevent his son from becoming a mark in this world. He wants to prevent him from becoming a mark from those who would try to hustle him. In this lesson, Solomon is going to lay out the biggest con of all time. According to the world, you're either in on the grift or you are the mark. You're either playing the game or you're being played. But it is possible, maybe, that there is a way to outsmart the game altogether. So I want us to begin with our lesson and see if we can find out if there is. Proverbs Chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, he says, "My son," he says, "attend unto my wisdom." That means pay attention. "And bow thy ear to my understanding." He says, listen. The same thing he says every time, right? It's what dad always says to the son. Pay attention, listen. He says that thou mayest regard discretion. That means to keep and guard the ability to make good plans and good decisions. And he says something special here. He says that thy lips may keep knowledge. That's something new. We haven't seen that before. So this starts with the normal encouragement to pay attention and guard wisdom, but he adds that statement that thy lips may keep knowledge. So just 3 thoughts on that phrase. Number 1 is that it fits perfectly within the context of someone who is a student who is learning, for your lips to keep knowledge. Whenever we study, we're constantly trying to memorize things so that we can repeat it back, right? We're always doing that. We're looking at stuff and then we're trying to memorize the facts and we're repeating it back constantly so that we are able to answer that question properly on a test. And so I was constantly in school memorizing stuff, walking away from my notes, repeating it back, and constantly saying it so that I would be able, whether it was an oral exam or whether or not it was on paper, I wanted to be able to give the right answer later. But in the broader understanding, what he's really focused on is unity with the Father. The end goal of all the memorization that we do in the Bible, of all the studying that we do, the end goal is that wisdom which comes out of the Son's mouth is the same wisdom that comes out of the Father's mouth. The Apostle Paul, in a variety of places, instructs the church to be unified, to have the same mind, the same spirit, etc. But I want you to observe how he states this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10. Do you see how he states that? He says, "Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of the Lord Jesus Christ," what does he say? "That you all speak the same thing." That you all speak, and that there be no divisions among you, that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind with the same judgment. See, that's what unity is when your lips keep knowledge, when you all speak the same thing. That's what he's wanting for his son. I want you to be speaking the same thing as me. Now, think about how people cause division, right? By far, the number one device used to cause division is what? Is your mouth. It's the number one weapon that causes division. But the mouth can also be used to bring unity just as much as it can cause division. And that's the idea here. The Son and the Father are unified in the wisdom that he passes on to him so that the Son is saying the same thing as the Father. But there's also kind of a poetic use, if I can add a third. There's a poetic use to this phrase here. He wants his lips to keep knowledge because he's trying to prepare the Son for what he's about to say in the next verse. He wants his lips to keep knowledge because he wants to prepare him for the lips of the strange woman. And that leads kind of poetically to the teaching that follows. And what we're going to learn in this particular section, here's where he really gets into the con of adultery. And that really is the subject matter, the con of adultery. in Proverbs Chapter 5, verses 3 through 6, we're going to see the con. What is the nature of this con? Every con has a plan. It all has a construct. They have to build up a scenario. He's going to tell us about the con of adultery here in these first 4 verses. It says, "For the lips of a strange woman, they drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, so that thou canst not know them." Okay, just a quick word about the theme of this lesson. I want to point out that the theme here concerns adultery. And yes, you can see that it's still addressed. The address at the beginning is still the same. He's talking to his son. This chapter would indicate that his son is old enough to be tempted by adultery and could very well, it's not guaranteed, but he could very well already be married. I want you to think about that. He could be old enough. Now, keep in mind that people in the ancient Near East got married at a much younger age than many of us do, but he is at least preparing him for what's going to come, and he's at least old enough to be tempted with this con. And so it happens, as it happens in this chapter, we get a little insight into how old this child may be. And of course, this training happens from a very young age, as we've seen, but it happens all the way up, into his adulthood. In the modern West, this is what this addresses. This is really kind of a side note, but I thought it was important. In the modern West, we have the idea that when a child approaches the age of approximately 18, that they're kind of on their own and that the parents are no longer accountable for their actions. Yet here the father of most likely an adult son who might even be married already is still under the father's instructions. Now you might say to yourself, well, at some point the children have to go out on their own and make their own decisions. I think we would all agree on that, right? They have to be able to go out and make their own decisions. But you might also say that when they go out and make their own decisions, that is the truest reflection of how you trained them. As it says in Proverbs 22:6, it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Right? Now, this may not be the case. It may be that the child rejects your counsel. Maybe you did teach them and they just rejected the counsel. In fact, that's here in this chapter in verses 12 and 13. That's exactly what the son says, is that I didn't listen to my teachers. So it could be that you taught him and he just didn't listen. But the idea that we kind of wash our hands of responsibility when the children become adults is certainly not the way that this father felt. That idea that we kind of wash our hands of responsibility when the children become adults is not the way this father felt. I don't believe that that's a concept that we can find in Scripture. And of course, this erroneous idea is certainly embraced by the children as well. They know, the children who live in households across the West, they know they just have to hold out until they can get out, right? Whenever they can get out on their own, then they can do what they want. They actually think that it's their life. It's just amusing. It's my life, right? Yeah, whatever. But what if? What if? They do. They think that. They think, this is my life. But what if? Okay, just think about it with me. What if we cherished and instructed our children, or as it may be, disciples, in such a way that as they graduate more and more into maturity and independence, they come to, in return, to cherish their parents and to cherish their counsel? What if their wise parents were to become a source of comfort and instruction and wise counsel throughout their entire life. Wouldn't that be amazing? What I'm trying to say is that they're not my responsibility anymore, or for the child to think, well, it's none of your business. That's not an idea that is either wise or wanted. It's not a good plan. Man, especially as a child grows up and they start to leave the home, that's when they need the parents' wise instruction probably the most. Probably the most. And even as I'm 40, what am I now? 48, just turned. Man, I still turn to wise counselors to this day. I am desperate for wise counselors, even into my rapidly growing old age. So we want to be able to have that relationship with our children and not just think, well, you're 18 now. It's not my problem anymore. That's not what we're looking for. So I just thought it was good to make note of that he's dealing with his son with a at the very least, you could say he's dealing with his son with a very adult problem. He's counseling his son on a very adult problem. So within this biblical environment, let's look at the instruction that the father provides. So back to the con of adultery. It says her lips drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is as smooth as oil. It says, but her end is as bitter as wormwood, and it's as sharp as a two-edged sword. It says that her feet go down to death, and her steps take hold on hell. Her ways are movable so that you cannot know them, so that you're unable, it says, to ponder the path of life. And notice he really everything he says focuses on the woman's body. Everything he says about her really focuses on the woman's body. I don't suppose there's any surprise there. The idea here is that he wants his son's lips to keep knowledge because he wants his son to be able to answer the lips of the strange woman. He needs to be able to give her a biblical response, a biblical answer. Do you see the context? And we look to Joseph as the perfect example of this in Genesis 39, verses 7 through 9. Can you turn over there with me? And I want you to see this, not because it's a complicated passage, but just because it's an amazing passage. Such a wonderful example of a young man, an adult, but a young man whose lips keep knowledge. Such a great example of it. Genesis 39, verses 7 through 9. Joseph says, talking about Joseph, it says, and it came to pass after these things that the master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, so see, she's got something to say, right? And what does she say? She says, lie with me. That's what the strange woman says. But he refused. And he said, that's a good start, by the way. He said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee. Because, why? Because you're his wife. I mean, that's a good answer. I can't do this because you're his wife. He says, and how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Man, Joseph is the man, isn't he? What a wonderful answer. I can't do this because this would dishonor my boss who's entrusted me with everything. I can't do this because you are his wife. And I can't do this because this would be a great wickedness against God. Just talk about a mic drop. That was wonderful. And of course, she pressed him, so he had to change tactics. And what does he do then? He just runs. He flees. So if the words don't work, man, use your feet, right? Just flee. It says, Joseph really teaches us here that really what this proverb means, that Joseph's lips kept knowledge. He had a wise, godly answer for the lips of the strange woman. It says her lips are like honey and oil. They are sweet and smooth. That really talks about their seductive flattery. But the description here, these words that they use are really a double entendre. if you will. The poetic language they use here is a double entendre, talking about her lips, which would be a double entendre for both her lips and her pudendum. As you can see in the Song of Solomon, chapter 4 and verse 11, he talks a lot about this. It's the same author, by the way, same author. Song of Solomon in chapter 4, verse 11, he's talking about his spouse. He says, "Thy lips, O my spouse, they drop as a honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon," which I think is a compliment that all men should reserve right there. You should keep that in the bank. Whenever you have a chance and you're kind of in the throes, tell your wife, "You smell like Lebanon," right? Just tell her that. Throw that in there. See how that works for you. But then he switches back in Proverbs 4, he switches and he contrasts the beginning, kind of the introductions to the strange woman. He contrasts the beginning with the end. And whenever it says here in the passage, it says her end is as bitter as wormwood, this is also a double entendre that's talking about her end in the sense of her destiny, but it's also talking about her end as in her hind end. It's like the old saying, I don't know if you've heard this, that, the honey is sweet, but the bee stings. Have you ever heard that expression? The honey is sweet and the bee stings. And what he's saying about this strange woman is that she has a sting in her tail. It's kind of the idea. But he means it in two ways, because she has a sting in her tail, but also talking about her end in the sense of what's going to happen afterwards. And he means afterwards in the way we would think of afterwards. He's like, what's it going to be like afterwards? You may give in to her, but what's it going to be like afterwards? She may appear sweet, but afterwards refers to the judgment also that follows in the passage. It says that her feet, where do they lead to? They lead to death and hell. The sweet honey turns into bitter wormwood, and the smooth oil turns into a sharp sword. Now, the sword here that's mentioned is so interesting, this word, two-edged sword. The idea of this Hebrew word, it means to have a wide open mouth. And again, still really with the motif of speaking in the lips and words. And it means to have a wide open mouth, as if he's saying that a two-edged sword is like going to come out of her mouth. And again, linking her lips and her words that will change from smooth oil to suddenly a sharp sword. Now, the book of Psalms in chapter 149 and verse 6, it comes close poetically to what this says. Not quite, but it comes close poetically to what this says in Psalm 149 and verse 6. If you are turning over there, verse 6, it says, "Let the high praises of God be in their mouth and a sharp two-edged sword in their hand." It just connecting poetically with what's coming out of their mouth with the sword that's in their hand. But you get it even more clear in Hebrews 4:12. It starts to become clear when you see that God's words are likened unto what? That's right. In Hebrews 4:12, it says, "The word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword." But it gets even more clear, the imagery that he's giving here. I think this is really neat. If you turn over to Revelation chapter 1 and verses 14 to 16, in this place it's actually given a description of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Starting in verse 14, it says that his head and his hairs, they were white like wool, and they're white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they were burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. He had his right hand 7 stars, and look at this, and out of his mouth went a sharp two-edged sword. In his countenance, it was like the sun that shined with its strength, right? Literally out of his mouth comes a sharp two-edged sword. Now what he's telling us here in this passage, when he talks about the end, like what's going to happen after. What's the end of all this going to be? The pretense of the strange woman that meets you in the beginning, it's very sweet and smooth, he says. But afterwards, he says what's going to happen, the result is going to be bitter judgment, is his point. It's going to turn into bitter judgment that's going to come literally out of God's own mouth from his word. And he tells us what that judgment is. The judgment is death and hell. He says that's where this all ends, he's trying to tell his son. It looks so good on the outside, but let me tell you where it ends. It ends with bitter judgment from the words out of God's own mouth. Her smooth talk is going to turn into a two-edged sword. Her ways, it says, are movable. This is a really interesting phrase when he says that her ways are movable. It reminds you of, do you remember in your Greek mythology class, do you remember Proteus in Greek mythology, that old prophet in Greek mythology? And he was able to tell people, the future, and he was able to give people information. And because of that, but in order to do that, they had to catch him and they had to tie him up. But he was able to change his appearance to anything he wanted so that they would never be able to tell who he really was. And that's kind of the idea of this word, is that she's able to change herself. The woman is able to be whoever you need her to be. She's able to be whoever she needs to be, unless, and this is the point of why she's so changeable, she changes who she needs to be so that you will never be able to see who she really is. It's a disguise. She changes herself so that you will never be able to see her for what she really is. And the reason why she does this is because she's trying to deceive you so that you will never, as it says in the passage, so that you will never ponder the path of your feet and see that you're on the path that leads to death and hell, so that you'll never ponder that path and get onto the path of life. She changes her appearance so that you will never see her. Because if you saw her for who she really was, you would jump off that path as quick as you could. So she's trying to deceive you. It's a con. That's what he's saying. It's a con. It's not what you think it is. That is the warning that Solomon is trying to tell his son. He said it's a con. You need to be wise. He's telling his son, don't be a mark. Don't be fooled. She looks good, but afterwards, there's hell to pay. That this really shows us the con of adultery, but it also pictures the con of the world, right? Turn to Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, it says, "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying, saying to me, Come up, come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of who? Of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." You see the figurative language that it uses for this world system. Not just one particular woman, but for this world system. See, just like the adulterous woman will try to seduce you, and it will seem sweet and smooth in her appearance, but it will turn to bitter judgment from the word of God out of his own mouth. And this judgment for following after the world instead of Christ is what? Is death and hell. That's the judgment. It seems so sweet when the world tries to seduce you away and tries to get you to follow her and to, the language used in Revelation 17, to crawl into bed with her. But what's it going to be like afterwards? You cannot be fooled by the short-term seduction. Short-term selfishness is foolishness that leads to judgment, but long-term loyalty is wise and leads to joy. So that's the con of adultery, but what about the cost? What about the cost? What is this con going to cost you? That's always the goal in a con. It's going to cost you something. So what is the cost of adultery? And here in verses 7 through 11 in Proverbs chapter 5, he tells them what it's going to cost them. He says, "Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house. Lest what? Lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger, and thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed." He says, stay away from her. And this demonstrates just how dangerous she really is. You can see how the end of chapter 4, when he tells the son to really ponder the path of your feet and let all of your ways be established, is setting you up for what he's going to talk to you about in this chapter. He's leading you to this lesson. And likewise, he says, stay far away from her. Don't even come nigh the door of her house. And why? Because it's going to cost so dearly. If you fall for this con, it's going to cost you dearly. What is it going to cost? Okay, it gives us 4 things here that's going to cost you. First, it's going to cost you your honor. And what these words mean, it means the splendor. He talks about you giving your honor and the years of your life unto the cruel. What the idea of this phrase is that the splendor of the best years of your life will be given to others. It will also cost you your wealth and all of your work. So all the labor that you endured to create your wealth will be given to strangers. That's in verse 10. It will also cost you your joy. It says you're going to mourn at the last. And it will cost you your life. And that really attaches this to verses 4 and 5, where it says that her feet go down to death and hell. And that's the way, with this poetic language, it always talks in circles. It always comes back around. It always does that. It doesn't talk in a linear way. This is always the way that a con ends. You think that you've stumbled upon the best deal of your life, but then one day you wake up. How does it always end? You wake up and you've been cleaned out. That's always the way a con ends. You think, man, I can't believe I just met this guy or this girl. I can't believe I just found this perfect deal. And then you wake up, and all your clothes and your car and your bank account, it's all gone. You're just cleaned out. That's what he's telling him it's going to cost. She will take everything, is what she's telling him. And the father explains also the state of mind that the son will be in if he falls for this. In fact, this statement is so clear in these next few verses. It's so clear. It's very possible that they might be talking about something that actually occurred. They might be discussing something that actually happened in the son's life. We don't know, but what he states to him here, he really tells him about the state of mind that you're going to be in after the cost. Once you wake up and you've been cleaned out, he says, this is what you're going to say. In verses 12 to 14, we see the clarity of adultery. And that's always what happens. After you've been cleaned out, then you can see it clearly. That's when you're like, oh, so that's what that meant. And I should have known that something was wrong when they said that, and we can see everything clearly after it's done. And that's what he says here. He says, and then you're going to say, what? How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to them that instructed me. He says, I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. It is always after the cost that clarity comes. And of course, that's too late, isn't it? Almost. This is what the father predicts the son will say, or maybe even alluding to what he has said. 4 times in this passage, the son takes complete responsibility. He says, I hated instruction. He says, my heart despised reproof. He says, I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers. And he says, I did not incline my ear to them that instructed me. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying, why didn't I listen? Why didn't I listen? I can remember a young lady one time who was dating a guy who was just bad news. He was bad news. And everybody knew it except her. And we tried to tell her, do not marry this guy, And you get the same, it's my life, whatever. Okay, yeah. And then, of course, she married him. It ruined her life. She's still paying for it to this day. She's like my age now. He's still a part of her life because they had kids. He'll never be out of her life. And now it's in these times when she's thinking, why didn't I listen to what my instructors were telling me? It takes us all the way back to chapter 2 when we're saying you have to come to that place where you put yourself in that inferior position as a student, as a son, to be able to just listen and learn what your instructors are teaching you. It's almost too late to realize it after. He said, they tried to tell me, but I wouldn't listen. If the father had not instructed him, then we don't have time to turn there, but according to Ezekiel 33, chapter 33, verses 1 to 9, if the father had not instructed him, then the father would be to blame as well. In Ezekiel 33, it talks about how when the army's coming, they have watchmen on the tower. And if the watchmen do not yell and tell everybody that the enemy's coming, then the blood is on their hands, right? If we as parents don't instruct our children, then we're to blame for their bad decisions as much as they are. They're still to blame for their own decisions, but so are we. But when he says he was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly, this tells us that this has become a public sin, right? In the Jewish and the Hebrew community, this would have been something that they would have brought before the council. He would have had to be judged for this. This has become a public sin. The assembly here is most likely the assembly of judges trying him for his sin. But we cannot miss the word almost here. Do you see that word? I was almost in all evil. Whenever we look at these verses, these 3 verses again, we can see that these verses can really be taken in 2 ways. They can be understood in 2 ways. Number 1, it can be a lament. It can be a lament of someone who's just been caught in deep trouble, right? I can't believe it. Why didn't I listen? That's the most obvious way. But it also resembles the beginning of a confession. Man, I should have listened. I was wrong. He takes full responsibility. This is my fault. I'm the one who did this. It wasn't my dad. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't my neighbors. It wasn't my environment. It was me. I did it. It resembles the beginning of a confession. Much like when you look at Luke chapter 15, verses 13 through 19, that prodigal son, when he has his moment of clarity, when he's down there with the swine, and which it was a dirty animal to the Jews, which demonstrates in the story just how far he had fallen, and he had lost everything. That's what it says. After the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and he wasted all of his substance with riotous living, which the elder brother tells us later was with what? With riotous women, with strange women, with harlots. Just to show you the connection, back to Proverbs 5. But when he had spent all, there arose a famine in the land, and he began to be in want. So it had cost him everything. And he went and he joined himself with a citizen of that country who sent him to feed the swine. I mean, to a Jew, that's the bottom of the barrel, right? And it says that not only, he even sunk even farther because he was so hungry, he was going to get into the trough and eat with the pigs because he was so hungry. He's about to starve to death. Literally, he's almost about to end up exactly where Proverbs 5 woman's going to take him, to death, right? But then what happens? It says that he comes to himself. He has clarity. And he says, this is my fault. I can't believe it. My father's servants eat better than I do. What am I doing? He looks around. He has clarity. He says, what am I doing? He says, he puts a plan together. I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, I'm not worthy to be called your son. I want you to make me a servant so that way I can pay you back. I can pay this debt off. And he gets back and he confesses to the father, I have sinned against you, against heaven. And he says, and before he even gets his plan out, the father doesn't even let him get the plan out. And he says, bring me the robe and the ring and the shoes, and we're going to have a party because my son was dead, but now he's alive. He was lost, but now he's found. And you know that the son in Luke 15, that prodigal son, if he was able to look back at that swine trough, you know, I believe that this is exactly what he would say. He would say to you, you know what? I was almost in all evil. In other words, I was almost done completely. It was, in other words, what he was saying is, it was almost too late. It was almost too late, almost. And that is a wonderful, wonderful word, almost. Because this really demonstrates, within this very harsh topic, it demonstrates the grace of God that's in there. This is a wonderful thing about God's grace, like the love demonstrated by the Father to the prodigal son. No matter, listen to me, no matter how far you have traveled down the wrong path, when that clarity of your guilt opens your eyes and you see your fault, you can confess it to your Father and you can find mercy. You can find mercy. You can confess it. In fact, Solomon is the one who said that in Proverbs 28:13. He says, he that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but he that confesseth and forsaketh them shall have what? Have mercy. There are some teachers out there that want to teach that if you've gone too far down on the sin spectrum, and of course they're the ones that create the sin spectrum, but if you go too far down the sin spectrum, then there's no hope for you. You're done. You're unredeemable now. And you can't support that with the Bible. That's a heretical teaching. The truth is no matter where you are at right now, and man, thank God for this, no matter where we are at right now, you can turn to God and you can find grace and you can find mercy. All you have to do is just confess it. If you cover it up, then it will be too late eventually. There have been many who have come to this place, and you talk to them, and they would say it's too late for me. But God's word answers back to them very honestly and with grace. He says this word that you find here in Proverbs 5. I don't know if you've ever talked to someone who's in that place. I used to do some chaplain work at the prison, both at Belmarsh and at Brixton, and talked to a lot of guys, and they would say, it's too late for me, man. But Proverbs Chapter 5, this is the word that God says back to them. Almost. Almost, but not yet. But not yet. You see, that's what adultery will do to you. It will con you, it will clean you out, and it will condemn you. But like the prodigal son, you can come to yourself, you can consider your path, and instead of being cleaned out, you can come clean. Isn't that wonderful? It doesn't have to clean you out. You can come clean with the Father, and He can set your feet on the right path. But what does this path look like? What's the alternative? You say, well, I'm not supposed to commit adultery. What's the alternative? What is the contrast to adultery? And that's exactly what his Father gives him here. He gives him the contrast to adultery in the next few verses 15 to 20. He says, drink waters out of thine own cistern and running waters out of thine own well. I guess you guys can figure out what that means. He says, let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be thine only, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and the pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, son, be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? So what does this say? He tells them, he says, I want you to enjoy a sexual relationship with your wife. That's the contrast to adultery, is enjoy a sexual relationship with your wife. Drink from your own well, son. That's what he's telling them. Drink from your own well. The well in the cistern in this passage is his wife. And he's saying to him that your sexual thirst should be satisfied by your wife. He says, let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, which is most likely referring to children that are born. And this could be taken two ways. The fountains and the rivers are most likely the tributaries that come from the main water source. The wife being the well and the cistern. From the main water source, you see rivers and tributaries. The idea of that is wife, meaning that it's talking about them having loads of children that come out of them, that this fountain is blessed. And the fountains plural in verse 16, come from the fountain singular in verse 18. But of course, the fountain could also refer to the man. I won't say any more than that, but it could be referring to the man and his fountain and his fountains that come out of that produce the seed of his wife. He says to the son, let your fountain be blessed. You can read into that what you will. In verse 17, it says, these children should be the product of your marriage and not the product of sleeping with strange women. Should not be strangers with thee, but thine only. Do you see what he's saying? You need to have this deep connection with your wife, a sexual relationship, so that you guys get to enjoy building a family together. That's the idea. But the sexual relationship with your wife, because he goes farther. You would have almost preferred that Solomon just stopped there, because that would have been really appropriate if he just stopped there in our minds. But the sexual relationship, thank God he doesn't just stop there, because that relationship is not just about satisfying an urge, because we can think that sometimes when the Apostle Paul, very wisely instructs us, man, hey, if you're going to burn in lust, then get married. You're like, well, that's really romantic, Paul. That's very romantic of you. Don't burn, just get married, and then you're fine. You're like, okay, please, anyway. So the sexual relationship is not simply, according to the scriptures, just about satisfying an urge or just about making babies. It's more than that, though that is a great blessing. And that's the idea, he says here, is that the babies are a blessing to the marriage, as opposed, in contrast, to when your mistress gets pregnant. Oh, that's a scandal, right? That's the worst thing that can happen. If you have a mistress on the side, if she gets pregnant, that's a scandal. When you have babies with your wife, it's a blessing. It's a wonderful thing that you get to build a family together. So he continues being even more explicit in verse 19 when he says that she should be as a loving hind and a pleasant roe. Now he's starting to get a little bit erotic when he says that. This is actually an erotic statement that he's making about the wife, because he's actually talking about her breasts is what he's talking about. To show you what I mean, if you turn over to Song of Solomon, again, written by the same author, Song of Solomon, when he's talking about his bride, he's like giving his son advice of what he's done himself. When he's talking about his bride, Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 5 to 7, when he's talking about her, this is exactly what he says to her. He says, thy two breasts are like what? Are like two young roes which feed among the lilies. I'm not even sure why that's a compliment, okay? But apparently in that time, they thought of these young roes, right? That's what he says back up in the passage. He says, let her be as a loving hind and a pleasant roe. These roes they're goats. That's what a roe is. It's a goat. Your breasts are like goats. That's a compliment you should not hold in reserve. Don't even try that one. That will not play today, okay? But apparently the young deer, which is the young hind, he says, and the pleasant roe, the young deer, which is like more of a doe type deer, and the pleasant roe, which is like this special kind of mountain goat. And apparently they thought of them as elegant animals, very soft and beautiful and elegant animals. And so it's quite the compliment when he says, this is what your breasts are like. They're like these soft, elegant animals which feed among the lilies. And that is why he follows this animal imagery back in chapter 5 with the references to her breasts. Because that's what he's saying. He's saying this is what her breasts should be like. You should be, in other words, cutting the chase here, you should think that her breasts are attractive. You should be attracted to her breasts. You should be satisfied. You should satisfy yourself with them. And the word breast, okay, buckle up. The word breast literally means teat or nipple. He's referring to a specific part of the breast. Now, he's not so much being erotic here. He's actually using this to paint a particular picture. When he tells you to be satisfied, the word satisfied literally means to drink your fill from the nipple. That's what he's saying. Now, the imagery there is making reference to the infant. He's using this as a picture to say, in the same way that an infant satisfies his hunger and thirst from the wife's breast, he says, in the same way, all of your hunger and thirst for sex should come from your wife and should be satisfied from her and from her breasts. That's the idea of what he's saying. It's very explicit imagery of what is going on between the husband and the wife. But he's saying that's the way you should be with your wife. You should be fascinated, and you should be just intoxicated with your wife. In fact, that's exactly what he says. Because when he says that you should be ravished with her love, the word love there means love making. You should be ravished with her love making. And the word ravished means for you to stagger as if you are drunk. Now, what he's saying here is he's saying you should always satisfy yourself with her breasts, and you should be intoxicated with her lovemaking. That's what he's saying. The lesson here is this. I'm so glad that we're through that. The lesson here is this. You should have a faithful connection with your wife so that you get the joy of creating a family together that you can rejoice in, but you should also have a ravishing and intoxicating sex life with your wife and with your wife alone. Your sexual thirst should be quenched by your wife, and you should be, the implication is not only that you should quench your thirst with her, but he's saying, but that your thirst and your hunger should be great. You should be very thirsty and hungry for her. The result ends in verse 20 with this rhetorical question. He says, if you build this wonderful life with this woman, the wife of your youth, and you build a family with her, building this strong connection with her, but also you have this intoxicating sex life where all of your hunger and thirst for her that is great is satisfied with her, he makes that rhetorical question at the very end, then why then would you then be ravished, be intoxicated with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? Why would you do that? And the embracing of the bosom is a reference to sex again. It's a reference to having sex with a strange woman. He says that there would be no need for adultery at that point. You'd have a fulfilled relationship with your wife. This is the kind of marriage relationship that we should have. It should be one that is a strong one, that builds a family, right? Not getting ladies pregnant that you're not married to, not having children with strangers, but having children with a wife that you love within the confines of marriage and having an intoxicating sexual relationship with this woman. That's the answer. That's the contrast to the con of adultery. So why in the world would you choose this path? There's some people in the world would say, well, why would we do that? Why would we choose monogamy? They would say, well, that sounds good, but maybe I don't want to walk that path. Why would we choose that path? That doesn't mean, because this is the way we think. We think, well, this, you said it's going to cost everything, and that should be bad enough. But the way we think as human beings is, well, that won't happen to me. I will be the one who gets away with it, right? I will be the one who doesn't get caught. So this is what he tells his son. He tells him, you cannot escape your sin. You cannot escape your sin. In the next 3 verses, he says, for the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. If the fact that it's going to cost you everything isn't enough, he tells them, this is why you choose this path, because your path, your ways, are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. His own iniquities are going to take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of his sin, and he shall die without instruction. In the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. Now you may not be pondering the path of your feet, but God is pondering that path. Let me tell you something. You want to know what the worst sound is to a criminal? The worst sound to a criminal, I won't tell you how I know this, is the sound of that faint siren in the distance. It's the worst sound. It's the worst sound. And you know that they're coming for you. It's a terrible sound. That's what Solomon is saying. He's saying the iniquities, they are going to catch you. They will tie you up with cords, and you will die without instruction. See, this is the lie from the strange woman. You see it in Proverbs Chapter 9, verse 17. What the strange woman says, this is what she says to you. This is part of the con. She says, stolen waters. Now, where are you supposed to get your water? From your own well, right? But what does she say? She says, stolen waters are sweet, man. That's part of the con. Stolen waters are sweet. And she says, and bread that's eaten in what? Secret is pleasant. What she tells you, the part of the con, is she says it's going to be sweet, and this is the one that clinches it, it's going to be a secret. But it never remains sweet. It turns to sour judgment, doesn't it? And it never stays a secret. It always finds you out. God sees everything that you're doing. And what Solomon is telling him, he's saying, listen, your sins, they are coming for you. That's the idea. They are coming for you. You can't escape them. You think that you can. That's the idea of these words. They're on the way. They've got cords. They've got shackles. They are on the way to get you. Because God knows exactly what you've done. Who do you think sent them? They are on the way, and they are coming for you. Proverbs Chapter 7, verses 22 to 23. What does he say? In the same context, this mark that gets caught up in the con. It says, he goes after her straightway, as an ox goes to what? The slaughter, as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till a dart strike through his liver, as a bird hasteth to a snare, and he knows not that it is for his life. That's what's going to happen. So, in conclusion, there is nothing that has brought men down and broken up homes more than adultery. If you want to master wisdom, master this first of all. Be faithful to your wife. Be faithful to your husband. There's almost nothing in this life that leads to more success, ultimately and practically, in your life than faithfulness to your spouse. Do not come nigh the door of her house. Now you think that, as the term is today, you think that getting some strange is the answer to your life, taken straight from this passage. But it is the greatest kind of foolishness. It is the biggest con that there ever was. This world today, it promotes so much. It promotes promiscuity so much. And he comes along to give us some advice, and he's like, don't be fooled. Don't be a mark. It's a con. It's a con. And to the Christians, I know that all of us, we shake our heads, right? We agree with that. So my question is that if we agree with that, why are we more guilty than the world? And you say, well, I've never cheated on my spouse. That's not what I'm talking about. Just as we've seen truths mirrored in Proverbs so many times, the truth of the adulterous man in this passage who is unfaithful to his wife, it mirrors the adulterous woman who is unfaithful to her husband in the Christian life. If you would, look back with me real quick, verses 12 to 14. As you're turning there, verses 12 to 14, see, the strange woman here pictures the world who's always trying to allure us away from Christ. And the answer to that is faithfulness to Christ. Do we think as Christians that we can slip off and crawl into bed with the world? I'm talking about spiritual adultery. Do you see the picture? Do you think that we can slip off and crawl into bed with the world? Do you think it will not cost you everything? As you look at verses 12 through 14, the 4 times the son claims responsibility for his own demise. I've hated instruction, despised reproof. I've not obeyed the voice of my teachers, did not incline the ear unto instruction. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the assembly. Now listen to me very carefully. The congregation that he is talking about for you, because remember the context is a congregation and assembly there to judge him. But as that pertains to you devotionally, the congregation and the assembly he's talking about is the judgment seat of Christ. That will be the congregation and assembly that you will stand before. And this is the lament. He's saying this is the lament that you will cry on that day. When you stand before the judgment seat of Christ, you know what you're going to say? Whenever you decided to sleep with the world instead of being faithful to your husband, you know what you're going to say on that day? You're going to say, why didn't I listen? How come I didn't listen to my teachers? Why did I despise reproof? Why did I hate instruction? I hated it when people tried to tell me what to do. I hated it when people tried to give me advice. But on that day, when the assembly is there all around you of believers, and you're being judged for the quality of your service, and you're going to be sitting there having been unfaithful to your husband, and you're going to think, why didn't I listen? And it says almost, that pertains to you particularly. You're going to say, I'm almost in all evil. Why? Because you're still saved, aren't you? You're still going to get in. You're still going to be saved. But it's going to take everything else away from you. It's going to still cost you the same thing. Remember in Proverbs Chapter 5, verses 7 through 11, what it says that it cost them? That pertains to us as well. I want to show you what it's going to cost you in these verses. It's going to cost you your honor, in verse 9. On that day when you stand before the Lord, if you've not been faithful to him, you will have no honor before Christ. On that day when you stand before the Lord, it says it's going to cost you your wealth and your work, verse 10. What that means is on that there will be no true riches stored up for you on that day. It'll cost you your joy. You're going to mourn at the last in verse 11. There will be no rejoicing for you in that day. And it will cost you your life. Even though your soul will be saved, listen to me. Even though your soul will be saved, the life that you spent down here will have been wasted. It will have been wasted. Do you want to master wisdom? Then understand this. If you want to be wise, be faithful, not foolish. Don't fall for the con. Be faithful to your spouse and to your Savior. This is really the ultimate lesson if we zoom out a bit. Listen to this. Short-term selfishness is foolish. Long-term loyalty, that is wise.